Welcome to another episode of Business Focus. This week we are talking all things pricing. With the knowledge I have of pricing, I see it as one of three key pillars when you're driving profitability. You've got the volume that you sell, the price it costs, or the costs of providing those goods to the market, and of course price. And pricing is something that a lot of people don't really come at with a particularly strong methodology or strategy. It can be cost plus, it can be competitor-led in terms of what are they doing, or client-led in terms of what's your budget.
Business Focus.
We wanted to get someone in who knows a lot about pricing, who has some very strong structure around how to help businesses get a sensible and long-term approach to pricing in play. I actually worked with this guy a couple of years ago in my last role and had great results, so I can speak to his success firsthand. And that man's name is Ron Wood, and his company is called Pricing Insight. Hello, Ron.
G'day, Brendan. Nice to see you again.
Likewise. Now, look, just before off camera, we were talking a bit about how you got to be where you are and have this pricing specialty that you do, or specialization. And you got to tell me about how it came from essentially being a musician. Why don't we kick off there? You can tell everyone what that association is so that it makes more sense than I just made it sound like it has. And we'll kick off from there.
Yeah, sure. I guess jumping out of when you asked me how did I get into the pricing, I really didn't. There wasn't any career called pricing specialist at that time. In fact, it wasn't for many years after even I was in it. But I wanted to be a musician and I wanted to study music, which I did do. And so reading and writing it and all that sort of thing, and playing guitar, etc. And then as I started teaching, I had a business, and then I realised I was in business. I was actually enjoying this business side of what I was doing as much. And then I enrolled in a business degree. And then from there, it snowballed where I just got offered a job with a company called Arnott's, and then I got involved in analysis there. And then I was sitting in a meeting one day and hearing them talk about the pricing of some products. And there was a few challenges with Woolworths and Coles, the supermarkets.
Still are, I think.
To discount. Yep, that hasn't changed in about 30 years.
Yep.
Yeah, that conversation's still being had. And so I remember listening to this as a young mid-20s and thinking, wow, pricing seems to be a bit of a bugbear for everyone. And I guess I was looking for direction as far as, how to develop your knowledge and your skills in business as you do. And I started just to study the data and tried to really get to grips with what it meant. And the fact that the prices were so volatile and they changed every week meant that it was a real focus point, and a lot of money being lost with the wrong prices being put onto products. And so coming from a small business background with my family, small business, every dollar counts. So I started to think, well, how do we fix that? And so I just applied myself to studying the numbers and coming up with some answers, and I was able to take those answers to management. And then I remember one of the sort of head sales guys said, would you like to do this full time? Meaning, would you like to study the numbers and the pricing full time? And I said, yeah, this is really enjoyable. And so he said, okay, tell me what you need. So a week later, I said, I need a team of 5. And then at about age 26, I was running pricing for the whole Arnott's company. So that's how it started.
Nice, fair play. Okay, and look, you've been doing this for a fair while now. When companies come to you to talk about pricing, what are the problems as they see it that they're trying to solve, or what are the indicators they're looking at that tell them they've got a problem?
Yeah, well, look, there are a couple of different triggers that companies look for help with pricing. I mean, initially everyone wants to solve it themselves. You don't want someone else to help you do this work. So by the time you want to get help, you've got a mindset that, look, we need someone else externally, a fresh set of eyes. Some of the trigger points are either they've had a profit impairment issue, so there's sort of a major profit trauma. They've lost a lot of money. They've miscalculated volumes, forecasts, or cost increases, or there's been a new competitive threat that's come in, new entrant to market.
Yeah.
The other one is general frustration in the sales force with the bureaucracy around discount approvals, price setting, and customer defections potentially happening. So there's usually some trigger point, and it usually stays around for a year or 2 or 3, and then it gets to a point where people can no longer take it, and then they say, right, we've got to do something about this. And that's when they reach out to someone and say, hey, we need to look at pricing.
Right, okay. I think I know when I came to you in my last role looking for help with pricing, part of it, being honest, is that we just no one knew where to start. Like, it's not really something, like you said, you were the first that you know of to have had this specialization, this singular focus, right? Pricing falls under sales and marketing or product typically, right? And so, but when you go, how do we get to where we are with prices currently? It's usually some manager somewhere sort of just kind of putting a finger in the air and going, I want that one to go up by 10%, that one by 3%, whatever. So it was really just going, okay, I actually don't know what to do this with any real, I don't know, structure. Is that something that happens a lot to you, or are people kind of a bit, I don't know, they don't really want to go straight out and just go, hey, I don't know what I'm doing, please help. Do they try and sort of coach it with anything else to ask?
Well, I think it's funny that, there's a level of maturity when someone says, hey, I really need help here. That's the sort of, you're sort of aware of your blind spot in a way. That's the kind of, we're all seek to get that level
There's a
of
positive
maturity.
focus on my lack of skill in that space. Thank you. I'll take it. Good.
I mean, I look at my role in with this is not to try and give people an intellectual knowledge bath that they need to clean them up. It's more saying, look, how can I be a coach to you because you're a high-level executive? I always make the comment, Roger Federer, Novak Djokovic, Rafael Nadal, that all at the top of their game and, never to be repeated sports people, but they've all got one thing in common, and that is a coach. So even people at the highest level of performance know that you can't be the object, the observer, and the observation. You can't be all those three things. You are either going to be observed and observations will be made about you, or you are the observer, but you can't necessarily be both. So the role of external person to come out, I think it's a very intelligent one because you're not necessarily hung up about domain control about an outcome, but you're actually just focused on the outcome.
Yeah.
So there's a certain level of mindset that comes with saying, hey, we need to get someone else to help us with this if we don't have an internal answer ourselves.
Yeah. And so I think the key message there for anyone watching that, it's just that it's okay to ask for help. And the way I've seen you go about it is, it wasn't like, hey, oh, that's your problem, cool, here's your answers. It was, okay, let's really make sure we truly understand the problem. Here's a framework that we're going to go through to discover the market around you, your own offering, what your clients are wanting, how that desire or what they deem as value differs between positions and company size. And then actually let's come back after all of that has been identified and let's see what you have made of that. And then I'm going to come back and kind of stress test some of those assumptions. It was very much, like you said, it was a coach, not, I'll just do this for you. And that actually set me up for success long term because I could go back and revisit that approach, every 12 months, 24 months, whatever, as part of that ongoing strategic focus on pricing. So anyway, that's me blowing smoke up your backside. There you go, as well. So both ways, that's good. Let's go back to actually, I guess, the problems, because I wrote down some other ones here as well. And that sometimes it's not a problem, it's an opportunity. So how do you know you're not leaving money on the table? Like, how do you, things are going well, you're making a bit of money. How do you know that you could do better? And is that what sometimes this is just about, just stress testing that you have in fact got the best opportunity in play?
Yeah, that's a good question. There's a couple of obvious ways that you can figure out whether you're leaving money on the table. And I'll go back to a comment you made before about, the different types of pricing. I mean, typically there's 4 types and 3 of them generally leave money on the table. The first one is the most common one, which is cost plus markup pricing. That's the sort of most rudimentary. I buy something for $1 and sell it for $2. If that's your approach, you can do that yourself. You don't need external advice to do cost plus markup pricing.
Yeah.
Or we have a target margin. We have to make 30% or 40% gross margin. Why? Well, that's just how the economics of our current volumetrics work. So that's what we do. That's sort of first thing. The problem with cost plus is that you eventually are either too expensive and you lose volume, so you won't make the sale because there's a mantra, we've got to make 30% on every sale or it's nothing. Mm-hmm. So you'll actually lose volume and then potentially lose on volume and secondary sale, et cetera, if it's sort of like a razor and razor blade type model. The second part is interesting is that, if you're cost plus and you set a price at 30% margin, how do you know that you couldn't have got 35 or 40% margin? A lot of businesses get hung up on a culture of a percentage number, saying this is the right percentage. We've even seen clients where on the one side, we had a procurement team beating up suppliers to get lower prices. And so those lower cost would flow through the system. And then this analyst on the other side going, oh, gee, we don't make 50% gross margin on these products. We only make 40%. So they would lower the price down by 10% and give away all those gains.
Right.
So that's cost plus in action. The other two is really what's known as market beat or compete. So whatever the competitor is, will just be the same or better.
Right.
So it's just, it's a dogfight. The third one is marked to market relativities. So that means if competitor X is, say, $10 for an item, we can be $12. So we don't match the beat, but if they drop to 9, we might have to go to 11. So we maintain this sort of mark to market relativity. So all of those three methodologies will mean you are leaving money on the table. And the reason being is because they're independent of the fundamental driver of a purchase, which is a consumer or customer's drive to access value. And none of those three methods actually are directly related to the concept of what is value. And so that leads us to the fourth pricing methodology, which is this concept called value pricing methodology.
Yeah, and and I'm super coming back to that because that's honestly the crux of this conversation. And I was going to try and sound smart by saying that compared to X is selling at 10, therefore we should sell at 12. It's not really what they're selling at; it's what they're delivering for that $10, and whether or not you're aligned with the same target market, right? And that's when you would start looking at what they're charging and whether or not that should be an indicator of if you are offering the same value to the same people, can you get away with charging 12 when they're charging 10? But we'll come back to that because I just want to set the scene a little bit more first by looking at the landscape as it is today. I last spoke to you, at least on a podcast forum, about 2 years ago. Yeah, about just over 2 years ago. And I think at that point, inflation was taking off and it took off for a while there. It's leveling back now, still over sort of Reserve Bank target rates, but it's what, 3.5 maybe roughly. What do you see is that a key risk still, inflation from a pricing perspective? How have you seen companies handle that period of inflation? And where do you think that sort of just puts the pricing landscape at the moment for most sort of, say, 50 to 200 seat organizations?
Yeah, well, there's never been a period in history where inflation has escalated so quickly, so fast, at such a magnitude. It's thrown pretty much every management team off their game somewhat until they started to ride the wave of inflation. And that meant that everyone was doing inflationary price increases, so everyone was making money. So taking a price increase was almost one of the easiest things in the world to do over the last 3 years.
Yeah.
And the two driving factors is the central banks around the world in concert printed 3 to 4 times the normal money supply.
Yeah.
They just literally put the money presses on and injected more money into the marketplace.
And how that wasn't ever going to screw everything up. I mean, you have to look at Germany in the 30s and like, how did they not know that was going to do the exact same thing it did in the 30s? Well, I think to keep the podcast in that narrow line, I can tell you the true answer, Brendan. It's all engineered and it's all been designed. That's the actual answer. But for the enjoyment of the average, we might have this will be the VIP version of it, but of the podcast. But I mean, they knew damn straight what they were doing, and they're still doing it. They're still printing money at elevated rates, and at the same time, they're raising interest rates. So what we actually are seeing right now is consumers running out of money at a rate of knots. Right.
And the cost of assets and debt levels at all-time highs. So you can sort of see it's playing out like a slow-motion train car crash.
All right, so we're going to come back to the whole value-based pricing methodology because that's the most important thing that we want to convey today in this conversation, I think, because it's so universally applicable and useful to everyone in mid-market, SME, really any business. But first, just to get a lay of the land, make sure that people are clear on why it matters so much and what the risk is of not looking at this. Let's just put some sort of context into where we are today. We've just come out of 2 years of record high inflation rates. We've got a calming of the inflationary pressure at the moment, but it's not perfect. It's certainly above Reserve Bank guidelines or what they'd like it to be. So for you at the moment, let's just take a look at, or could you tell us what you've seen in the way pricing's been handled during that inflationary period, that very high period, and where we're at now, and what you see as the biggest risks when it comes to getting pricing right in 2024?
Yeah, okay, that's a really good question. So the thematic for the last 3 years has been expanding money supply and low interest rates. That's meant consumers had incredible flexibility with their purchase power. We're also seeing governments in stimulate economies with payments to families. So the savings rate over the last 3 years went to 25% of household incomes versus a long-term average of around 7%. So quite a substantial amount of cash was banked up into consumer households. And with interest rates being low has led to a property boom, which we've all seen. It's also led to a massive increase in demand for various items and consumer goods. So spending has been at all-time highs. The impact for businesses has been that price increases have been relatively easy to undertake. And because it's a global inflation phenomenon, meaning that it started with commodities, a lot of big hedge funds, a lot of big places that have reservoirs for cash and for commodity protection were buying up commodities. That drove commodity prices up, which then went into the factories to make the products. The factories then passed that through the supply chain, eventually onto the shelves of consumers or into the hands of B2B customers. So it took some time, but the inflation has been systemic and global. So it's meant that every company and every competitor is basically had to play the same game of raising prices. So in many senses, taking a price increase over the last 3 years has been fairly simple and without challenge because everyone is doing it. Suppliers, customers, and customers is all taking price increases. And as you point out, we're now at a point where that's slowed. We had food inflation running at 10% a year or so ago. That's come back. Some of the official inflation figures are probably dampening down of actual inflation because in certain sectors you've got 50 and 100% inflation. In other sectors it's a lot less. So the volatility around price changes is also different by a different sector, but in essence you've seen large price increases going through, generally being accepted by the market. The difference now is that we're still seeing some cost pressures coming through, but with interest rates being increased 12 or 13 times in a row in the last sort of 24 months, the power of consumers to spend has been drastically dampened. And so the implication for that is that the demand has fallen off, so that means that prices can't keep continually going up. Some retailers, to give you some specific case examples, use the inflationary period to get ahead of inflation, so they would take if costs were going up 5%, they'd take prices up 7 or 10%. Right. So they would use it to improve their profitability. What we're seeing right now is we're seeing a slowing, if you like, in some areas, and then a refocus on protecting margins and profitability. So there's different focuses coming in from just taking price increases and moving volume to more about protecting margins and holding profitability.
Fair. Do you think some of those companies that put prices up to a greater proportion than they were having COGS increase did so as part of maybe a 3 to 5 year pricing strategy where they knew that inflationary period would end? They would have decreased demand, meaning that people became more price conscious, more value based, and more negatively responsive to further price increases. So they could actually do what you're saying, which is hold and maintain that profitability. Sure, it would shrink as course COGS continue to grow, but they would have factored that into their budget over a 3 to 5 year period. So now they could basically hold price as is, having had a higher period of profit that wouldn't last forever. Do you think that's part of an overall strategy for any of these players, or is it not? Are they not that smart? It was just take more money while they can.
Look, I think every business, every listed company definitely has long-range business plans. Whether they're 2 years, 3 years, and some even have 5 years. I mean, the general consensus is that anything more than 2 to 3 years out, you're kind of guessing. But yeah, and I honestly think that most of the companies that took those price increases were more opportunistic, because I don't think they had factored into any of those business plans the types and the quantum of inflation that came through. That wasn't factored into the business plan. When they wrote those business plans, they were thinking costs would go up 2, 3, 4%, not costs going up 10, 20, 30%. And then once they've, I guess, determined that, look, we just took a price of 20%, and we haven't really seen a drop off in volumes or demand. The consumers have just accepted it. It's a lot easier than taking another 5 or 10% after you've just taken a 20%. So I think what happened with a lot of companies was it's like they discovered a superpower that they never knew they had. And a lot of them were saying, wow, did we just do that? Did we just take a 15% price increase and we're still holding volume, if not growing our volumes?
Yeah.
So it wouldn't take much for that management team to reconvene another month or two later and say, well, okay, how much are we going to take prices up this month or the next month? So I think it's probably more opportunistic, but it also speaks to the maturity of a lot of businesses where pricing is still an evolving capability in business.
For sure. And I don't want to sound too cheesy, but that, superpower, when I last worked with you, again, it sort of showed me that it can almost be that, probably not indefinitely. You can't do it every single time, but if you are off the mark to start with, it really is this unexpected sort of, superpower move you can do. It's a cheat code to drive profitability. I think we threw GP up by about 20%, and we weren't off a low base. So it was a pretty good result. And a lot of that came not just from changing the prices, but changing the product mix. And we'll come back to that as well, because I think that's the thing. The pricing doesn't stand alone. It's a factor of product. It's a factor of the plans, the pricing, the way you convey value, the messaging to your market, actually understanding who your market is, all that sort of stuff. But I want to go through one last thing before we start talking about the value-based pricing methodology in general. And something you provided to me prior to this was about what drives gross margin down. And to rattle off a few, we've got commodity mindset. So again, not value-based, it's a thing. And sometimes that will depend on industry. You've got inability to manage price increases. So no structure there, no way to convey it effectively. Cost plus pricing culture you've touched on. Pricing complexity and consistency. I was at the AWS summit in Sydney recently, and they've got so many products, it's impossible to know what you can buy from them. So that stood out there for me, but they're doing okay. They'll be fine. Negotiating with procurement, reliance on discounting to win business, management misalignment, and undefined value drivers. Let's use that last one as a jump off into the value-based pricing methodology. Can you kind of tell us at a high level what it is and how it came about, how you came to that as one of your key frameworks?
Yeah, well, so what became fascinating starting to work in working with multiple companies probably 15, 17 years ago was how one product could have a gross margin of 50, 60%, whilst another could only have 20, 30%. And they'd be side by shelf in the same category. And once I started seeing this phenomena over and over again, it became apparent that there was something at play here that was allowing a certain product or a category to have incredible gross margins. Like, so why do hip and knee replacements have gross margins of 90% or 80%? And the average medical company has a company-wide gross margin of 70 to 75%, which is astounding. The average building materials company, it's not bad. It's up there with software. Microsoft has those sort of gross margins. Whereas a building materials company has gross margins of between 30 and 35, 40%, maybe max. So you would see all of these different profitability profiles, and some of them seem obvious, like paper and lumber and what you would typically call commodities seem to have lower gross margins and lower profitability, whereas IP-driven industries, and software, marginal cost of zero type stuff to sell software, have high gross margins. But within even those industries that they play in, they've also got different price premiums. So even in a high gross margin industry, some profits might be 95%. And it became apparent that there was a different perceived value that customers would ascribe to a certain product. And I just set to work trying to understand that value, because there's a phrase I use called, are you selling the molecules or the customer outcome? So selling the molecules is when you just describe what we do as a commodity. and you say that company sells, let's call it cement, just basically a grey powder in a bag. That company sells what looks like to do the same thing. Can you differentially price those products even though they look identical? It turns out you can, but it's not about focusing on the product per se or the molecules. It's looking at the totality of value that's obtained by the customer outside of the physical product itself.
So where does a business start? What's step one in coming up with a value-based pricing approach?
I think it's really important I always say pricing is a team sport. So it's really about bringing a group of people together from sales, marketing, finance, operations, and even the executive leadership team to come together and say, let's look at our business and why we exist, and not write a vision, mission, value statement, but describe the problems we solve for customers. So the secret sauce for any kind of value pricing or discovering your pricing power is to truly get to grips with the quantum and the magnitude and complexity of the problems you solve for customers. And that can be derived from brainstorming internally, just because, hey, we've all got collectively 100 years experience in this room. We should be able to know what customers' problems are. That's a good start, but then there's a famous phrase from start-out language called get out of the building, and what that means is to go and see customers and talk to them. And that means to go and literally interview them and speak to them and get to know their problems and pain points. And that is the gold, is to hear that directly from them. And outside of a selling dynamic, so often a salesperson might go and try and do a sales call or a pitch, and they might be asked to do a bit of customer research as a tack on or add-on. The customer's not going to give you true confessions because they're still in you're selling, I'm in buying mode, so they've still got their buying hat on. So their willingness to necessarily be candid about their problem set will be low. Whereas if you can meet with customers outside of that dynamic, you'll get some pretty good problem set confessions. But that problem set identification is really the core or source of the river of facts that you can use to then determine where value can be understood and then translated into pricing power.
So one thing I liked about your approach, though, was that feedback is able to be put into a clear structure that enables there to be numbers that come out of the bottom of it. Like, what's our value alignment, or actually, what's our value premium versus deficit against the competition. So asking people who've also had experience, or getting multiple people to give you insights as to supplier A, B, and U, and then exactly which elements of the product, and particularly, I guess, in the technical world, whether it's customer support or price points or delivery speed or workmanship or whatever, and putting that alongside each other to come out with that special number. Do you want to just touch on a bit how that process works when done well, from where you sit?
So probably with value pricing, I like to talk to clients about 4 key tests that you can ask to determine whether you can do value pricing with your customers. And the first one is, and this is probably for a B2B environment, if you like, is does the product or service we sell allow our customers to increase their prices or margins or revenue? So can we help our customers grow their top line and their gross margin line? The second question is, does our service or our product create a productivity dividend for our customers or lower their cost of doing business? So in their operating costs, something comes out. So something at the top line, something in the SG&A, the operating costs. The third one is, if we're aligned, can we give them some economies of scale because we're getting better economies and volume, so we can lower their cost of acquisition of the product itself. So effectively a discount for volume type arrangement. So because we've got commitments, could be 1, 2, 3, 5 years type thing. So there's 3 key areas, but there's a 4th area that really explains the pricing power that you have versus a competitor. And that is a concept I call the value at risk, or the risk mitigation factor. And this risk mitigation factor appears endlessly in every industry where there is pricing power. or where there are premiums to be obtained. When risk is understood by customers and sellers of products or services understand and can market and sell that risk, then there is a transaction at a higher gross margin.
Okay. So let's dive into that. What is it? What is value at risk?
Yeah, so value at risk comes in three key forms. The first value at risk is the risk of no supply. So in other words, the product or service actually doesn't turn up. And just by way of information, professional procurement managers, who are these are professional buyers in corporations now. When you go to procurement university, the number one thing you are told is to secure supply. Supply security is the number one objective of all procurement people. It's not lowering prices, it's not obstructing concessions, it's actually security of supply.
That's so interesting, given what we've just come out of that period where supply was very much not guaranteed. And I guess we need to think about that too, not just from the supply of a physical product. It could be something like, I've just come from the world of telco, right? Does the internet work? What's the risk of this not working? So value at risk is what's the uptime or potential downtime, more importantly. So please continue.
Yeah. Well, so you're absolutely right. They're good examples. Like if the feeder, let's say it's called plastic cables, for example, just pick a product, like the internet, just to riff off the internet. I had a client that sold the plastic resin that went on the coating for the cables that went to make the internet cables. And they told me an interesting story where they said they're busy being beaten up on their pricing, but because they needed supply in very short notice periods, they were buying in like minimum lead times of less than 2 weeks. So this company had the flexibility to provide that short turnaround. But if that supply wasn't there, then they might look to go somewhere else. But they're prepared to pay a premium because they get that certainty of supply. So that's, and I'll keep using this case example because it's interesting in terms of explaining it. So certainty of supply is your number one sales criteria when you're marketing a product using value at risk as your key criteria. The next one is product or service failure. In other words, it gets delivered, but it breaks down. It could be straight away, or in other words, you press the on button and it doesn't work, or it's working for a time, or it's intermittent and it's not fit for purpose. This same client was telling me about a competitor that had supplied resin that was faulty and it wasn't pure. And so they fill up the tanks, these big silos full of this resin, ready to use it, and it was found to be contaminated. So they had to drain the tanks of this faulty resin and clean the tanks out. It cost them something like $5 million to do that. The contractor's probably worth $1 million, and they've probably saved $50,000 or $100,000 on that contract, which has then cost them $5 million.
Yeah.
So there's a classic example of a value at risk, and if you can teach that to your customer about what's known as second to fifth order consequence, if something goes wrong and something else goes wrong, that means something else goes wrong, and each time those things go wrong, they escalate exponentially in their impact on the business. So product failure is another critical area of pricing power, that if you can sell the fact that you've got assets, you've got redundancies, you've got quality control checks that mean that you have a much higher level of quality than someone else, you could show that it's worth paying that premium for. So that's the second one.
Sorry, I will let you get to the third one because it's important, but do you think people buy off fear? Like if you try and convey the value at risk through trying to scare people into buying from you at a pricing premium, do you think that works, or do people buy off more positive emotions?
There's a bit of research on this that says that different people like to buy positively spun fear, if that makes sense. So an example of that would be, now you no longer have to worry about downtime because we've got 98% uptime.
Get ahead of the competition with that'll be
I think to sell value, it's more nuanced now. You can't just send out a simplistic FOMO message of don't get caught short with X or Y. The classic value at risk marketing play in the 70s was nobody got fired buying IBM. That was a classic phrase, stick with the safe, tried and true, and you won't lose your job. So that's a classic, but that's a very clumsy, in 2020, the modern age now, there's very clumsy communication, which most people go, I see what you're up to here. If you're doing it right, if going back to that original principle or objective of discovering your customers' pain points and their problem sets, you're actually communicating things that matter to them and are specific to them. You're not trying to just create a general campaign of fear or, people often use the phrase fear, uncertainty, doubt. These types of phrases that have been around forever are too clumsy for the modern world of marketing and selling. And pricing for that matter. It really requires someone to be rifle specific and to make that risk mitigation contextual with that company's specific operation so that they can see the assets or the product that they're potentially going to buy, and the way the salesperson or the marketing communication has articulated that fits with their perceived understanding of the problem set.
Fair.
So
okay, well put.
To sum it up, it's a more nuanced way of communicating and more customized and specialized.
Yeah, so you can't just go out and go, you are doing it wrong if you don't fix this thing. There's got to be some way of associating a positive connotation or a opportunity to get ahead in some way while basing it all on the fact that there's a massive risk if they don't address this or don't address the opportunity to buy off you. I think is what you're saying, hopefully.
Yeah, that's right. It's
Cool.
To sort of make sure people watching the session are understanding it. It's really about customizing messaging to specific target markets and specific audience members, and even the science of customer value marketing and selling and negotiation gets down to persona mapping and managing. So. Yeah, I'll give you a case example. A client of mine selling medical technology products, hip and knee replacement gear, and they will focus on what matters to the hospital CEO, CFO, the nursing unit manager who sort of manages the floor with all the goods, the doctor advisory buying group, as well as the hospital procurement. So there's probably 4 or 5 different key stakeholders that have their need states and their want states understood and addressed and communicated to. So what does it mean? It means that, yes, there's an additional and extra investment in marketing up front that's required now, but the payoff is that you protect your prices and your margins later and more ongoing. So, and there's less reliance on, I guess, the negotiation tap dance at the time or the sales meeting, the critical sales meeting. There's another phrase I like to use is that called pre-sold. You want your customer pre-sold on this concept of value in use and value at risk before they meet with you. You don't want to be educating them on this in a 45 or a 60-minute meeting.
No, fair. And I do remember in the process again I went through with you, I think I had the same conversations with people in the same business across, I think, the CFOs or the finance manager, depending on the size of the org, the IT manager, the head of the help desk, or whatever because I was selling to MSPs in those days. But it was about 5 conversations that I had with each business to understand how the perception of the value we were offering changed across those roles. And it was really interesting to see, some would score us on, 3 for pricing if they were in a finance role, but, maybe an 8 if it was an IT role because they saw the value at risk component very differently. So on that nice segue, which I'm very pleased with myself having lined up, let's go back to the next one on the value at risk, section of the matrix.
Yeah, so the third key one is the value at risk of technical or innovation support failure. So in other words, to keep our internet metaphor going, you might get some cheap internet, but then when things go wrong, the troubleshooting wait time is 3 hours. And you would swear black and blue that never again, and you might not get service for 2 weeks, for example. So that is often not understood when someone's signing up for a service. They go, wow, it's $60 a month, that's cheap. I don't want to pay $90 or $80 a month for my internet subscription. But if they've got a mission critical operation and then if there's downtime, the economic cost of that downtime far outweighs the $20 a month saving. Or they're using large volume data bytes, so they need large upload and download speed. So they're not getting that because it's all getting shaped or limited. So that leads to sort of the next part of the equation, which is your value is dependent on two factors called the application and motivation. And that is the application is in what context will the service or product be used. So if it's in a high demand, stakes are high environment, then paying a premium makes a lot more sense. If it's in a low risk environment where it's just family internet usage at home for entertainment, then people's price sensitivity might be higher. But the other part of this is what's called the motivation to buy. So what's the trigger to buy from someone? So when you see someone wanting to buy a bandage, let's say, in a pharmacy, they might be buying that bandage because they think, we need some first aid gear in the pantry, just in case. Or they might have a serious bleed and they need to bandage that straight away. So their urgency, their motivation is high. So just carrying that metaphor forward, it's really important to understand the application and the motivation. And then that then feeds in your problem set, which then feeds back to your value drivers and then your assets and your product.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, isn't it? If you don't have a clear vertical, if you're going for a real mass market approach, that probably gets quite hard to tap into because you can't understand every single person's motivation. Or even if you can, you certainly can't market to it all because it's a hell of a complex message if you're trying to capture everyone. So there is an element of not pick a lane, but pick some lanes as part of this process because you can't be everything to everyone.
No, that's exactly right. And I think, from the Mad Men era, having a unique selling proposition still holds true, particularly in it's a busy, noisy world 20 years ago. It's an even busier, noisier world today. So how do you translate this concept of value into a message or something that can be encapsulated in some form of marcoms to the world? You've got to pick a market. If you're a newer business startup, for example, or you're trying to grow a market, you obviously want to own a beachhead sector and then expand from there. You don't want to try and own every single sector. Or you become known in a certain industry. It's a classic where certain products command price premiums because they're known in that sector as having the best product. And the case example would be a brand of forklifts called the Hyster brand forklift. It's known in the timber industry for its capabilities and reliability. So it commands a price premium versus its lower price competitors, even though that particular category of materials handling is often considered a commodity in the lower capacity segments. But in the 7-ton segment, which is where the timber industry plays with this product, that particular product commands a premium because they're known in that specific industry. I mean, ultimately, they're lifting up something that's heavy that takes 7 tons, but it's just that it's connected to timber.
It's more niche, and you can have a specific segment, and you know who you're speaking to, and you know what they need. So, it ties up. But something else that comes into this, when you've done a lot of that analysis, you've spoken to your customers, potential customers, and the potentially the current or former clients of your competitors. You kind of have to know your competitors' price points, right, to understand what your pricing premium or deficit is against them. Sometimes in some markets that'd be easy going through, which is largely what I did in my last role, had someone go through everybody's websites for me and go through all of their online pricing tools, etc. Where it's a little bit harder, what sort of advice do you have on how to get that detail to understand where you actually sit against the market?
Yeah, well, in a lot of B2B industries and B2B services particularly, the market pricing is very opaque. Services in particular, because often you're not comparing like for like service packages or service bundles. There's different ways to go about it. one of the ways is to simply ask customers, where do we sit? And you might get some self-serving answers on that. Well, you're definitely the most expensive in the market, which is the standard procurement script. We've benchmarked you and you're 30% too dear. That's so. Sometimes that can be kind of a pointless expedition. The other way, if you have colleagues or parallel industries where you can partner and try and find out information around what's being charged for various products. The other more nefarious way that goes on is mystery shopping. So this is what happens. Say, I'll give you another example, capital equipment. They will set up a bid or a tender document and send that around to all the competitors and get them to fill it in. And it's all done through a buying agent, sort of like a third-party firewalled agency, and you will get a whole raft of quotes. And then what that third-party agency will do is go back to all those competitors with their proposal, said, hey, like, I've got your proposal, it's really interesting. We're going to refine it down to the final 3 from the 7 or 8 that we received. In order to do that, you'll need to give us your absolute best walkaway price. We won't come back to you with another price request, but at the moment your prices are higher than what we want to pay. So I'll give you 5 days to come back to me. And so that's how you will get market intel. And you don't need to do that all the time, but at least give you a sense of how each competitor behaves.
What's interesting for me in that is that if you have competitors that are value-based in their approach already, they're going to probably self-select out of that scenario. They'd probably be sitting there going, if this is clearly a price-driven exercise, like this, whoever this mystery bidder is, they are looking for a price-driven commodity type mindset or coming from that mindset. And I mean, I can only speak for, First Focus as a company. Like we would definitely self-select out of that. If we can't add value, if this is all about pricing. So even in that, you would get a sense of, okay, in the market, there are some companies who have no interest in this. So we can already take as a given that they probably got some level of premium, over and above the what we will see as the rest of these responses. But I think that would definitely be the case.
It's. I'm not saying that these sorts of industrial espionage types happen, but they do happen.
They definitely happened, for sure. But I think it's just one of those things where it's like the unintended consequences. You would definitely find out who the value-based sellers already are, because they wouldn't. That just self-select out.
Oh, without a doubt, and I think that that would come across loud and clear in the collateral and the way the price is presented to a customer or a prospect. And the challenge is that right now, say procurement get tasked with finding cost savings. That's their job. Cut our procurement budget. We say a 50 or a 200 seat business might be turning over, 20, 50 million, something like that. They might have a cost base of $10 or $15 million or $20 million in bought-in items. A procurement manager, might be trying to find 10, 15, 20% savings. So the challenge is that procurement get benchmarked on those savings, but not the consequences of those savings. So if those savings turned out to be false economy, there's a classic where one of the big mining companies went and got cheaper tyres for these big trucks. There's big trucks that have a tyre that's the size of a small house. And, of course, the tyres started exploding. Now, the cost per hour of downtime for a truck, or it's the cost to replace the tyre, take it off the road or the track in the mine, is incredible. So that's a classic example where the procurement manager doesn't get measured on that downtime. They get measured on that invoice price saving. So the challenge for any value-based selling and pricing negotiation is to make sure that what's called the second to fifth order consequence of buying cheap, and therefore putting your business at risk of downtime, etc., is well understood across all of those personas.
Yeah, great call. Okay, I mean, the challenge with pricing as a conversation is it's so broad and there is so much that goes into it that we're never going to capture it all. So at some point, I'm going to have to say, okay, we can call it. But I do want to sort of give companies leave by giving people a good sense of understanding where they're currently at. And something else you have is a pricing capability model.
Yeah.
And as far as I know, there's 5 stages. There's the initial stage, repeatable, defined, managed, and optimized. Can we maybe just finish up by going through that, just sort of giving a few bullet points on each so that people can say, yeah, I probably identify myself as having a company in that position currently, and maybe then that'll help them know whether they need to really take some action.
Yeah, well, thanks for that, Brendan. Happy to talk about the pricing maturity model. It's really about trying to understand where we can go with pricing and also benchmarking as potentially competitors and other industry companies that you want to actually pursue or to copy their ideas, for example, that work well. Probably the lowest level of pricing is really the initial, which is this sort of characterized by sort of ad hoc price decision making. Everyone's in the pricing kitchen making a decision. It's very fragmented and very reactive. If you feel like that's your pricing environment, you're at the lowest rung, you're at the lowest level. And your risk of margin erosion is very high.
It's a
potentially
given, essentially.
300 basis points of margin, 2-3% points of margin are being left on the table in that environment because it's just so chaotic. The next level up, once you get some order into the business, is what's called repeatable. You've got some basic processes written down and documented. You've probably got, a few people that are in agreement about what good looks like. And you've got some kind of consensus being built, particularly around agreeing what we want to move away from. So there's an element of that, but there's still that reactive, chaotic nature to it, but there is some processes in place. There is some controls. There is some guardrails.
Can that be as simple, though, as it's the CEO's choice? He'll look at it once a year and he'll tell us what he wants us to do. Can that be as simple as repeatable sometimes is?
Yeah, look, if you can simply say, if you can point to a document or an email with some rote rules where they're just simple rules that are being articulated, you must do this policy, for example, that's a repeatable process. Okay. I've just joined the company. What's the rules? Or here are the 10 rules about pricing. Sure. That's okay. Repeatable. That's level 2.
I would say heaps of companies are there in the mid-market. So that's probably a basic starting point.
You're absolutely right, Brendan. In fact, that's our experience, is that most companies aren't ad hoc, chaotic and reactive. They might feel like that from one day to the next. But when you look at it, they do have some kind of policy. They do have some kind of system. And they do have some kind of rule or guideline that does get enacted. Not all the time. There's lots of exceptions often that happen, and we're not going to take a price increase to these 5 customers because they're valuable customers and we don't want to upset them. That's still in that repeatable space, but repeatable still leaves you exposed to significant margin risk.
Okay, and then we've got defined as the next step up the chain.
Yeah, so define is when companies start to get a bit serious about pricing. They might have a person who's dedicated to pricing manager, pricing analyst. A lot of companies are hiring those people in now to actually own the pricing process, whether it be operationally or whether it be sort of strategically. The bigger companies are hiring big strategic pricing management executives in with a team to try and drive pricing capability. Smaller and mid-markets might invest in a pricing analyst just to keep the operation moving. But you've got policies documented, you've got rules driven, you've got a person in place, and there's a clear mandate from management that we're going to actually focus on pricing. So that's your sort of defined category.
Okay. And then we hit managed?
Yeah, so level 4, you're starting to get in that sort of really high level, sophisticated capability. Not only have you got everything documented down, but you've got well-established KPIs, both leading and lagging indicators. You've got formal processes in place, formal roles and responsibilities laid out. This is what sales do, this is what marketing do, this is what pricing function does. on that, you have a dedicated pricing function. So
Right.
simple rule of thumb, for every 100 million of revenue, you want a pricing manager and an analyst. And then for every 100 million of revenue, you add another analyst. So $200 million company, you'll have two analysts and a manager for those people. That's the sort of formula I generally advise. And you've got engagement from everyone in the business. It's not a case of the pricing team's there doing their thing and we're over here as sales and we'll ignore them and they'll just do their thing and we'll do our thing. You've got everyone engaged in pricing. So there's a culture starting to emerge. It's clearly a pricing or value pricing led culture.
And how does it get better from there to be that final optimized stage?
The optimized stage is really where you've got self-referencing, self-learning going on, and you've got optimizing going on. So you've actually got potentially not only everyone trained in pricing so that they can all feed back into the loop and the mix around what to do about pricing. So everyone is kind of a pricing warrior, if you like, to actually identify margin opportunities. And that means everyone's trained in pricing. You've got this pricing team with some high performers in it. You might also have some form of software capability or a methodology to continually optimize and test. You'll be running experiments all the time, thesis or hypothesis-led experiments to determine and learn where you're taking pricing there. So it's level 4, but on steroids, if you like.
Yeah, fair enough. Okay, cool. One last thing, actually. I said that was the last. I lied. There's one more question. Just something you mentioned to me a while back was the term revenue integrity. What do you mean by that term? How does that fit into it?
Yeah, so revenue integrity is really about the quality of the revenue and how replicatable is that revenue quality. So everyone's heard of the phrase of, profitless prosperity. We go and sell a whole lot of business, bring in a whole lot of revenue, but it brings in no profit.
So revenue is vanity, profit is sanity, cash is king kind of concept.
Exactly. Yeah, that's exactly right. So, and how do you end up with the lack of integrity? You grow 30% with your revenue, but no profit. That's the revenue integrity piece here. Aligned to that revenue integrity piece is some of the other mechanics around it. So levers around discounting, levers around customer price setting, levers around rebate management. If you're paying your customers rebates, etc., or receiving rebates from suppliers, there's a revenue integrity around your top line price increases, and obviously selling and then discounting, customer price positions where they just sit out every day, and then other mechanics like rebates and surcharges. Usually a lot of these things are often inconsistent or poorly managed, and so the integrity around those things is not great. So revenue integrity is really about the interplay between all these levers and whether we grow our revenues but do it profitably.
I think there would be a really interesting dedicated chat we could have around revenue integrity and managing pricing discounts in a reduced demand environment. Like if people are going to be more price sensitive as everything you said about this post heavy inflationary period comes into play, when and where to discount and how to discount in a way that doesn't erode revenue integrity, as you said, is going to be a really interesting conversation topic.
Well, Brendan, I think you're absolutely right, and that probably is a good sort of signpost for what's next. If business is asking what's next going to happen, I think with consumers running out of cash, there's a flow-on effect that eventually will flow on, and we'll see significant downturns in demand coming through. So the focus will switch to this revenue integrity around discount controls. I've got a client does large revenues, and they've got hundreds of millions of markdowns in their retail environment. So if they can get a 5 or 10% efficiency in that discounting and markdown, that could be worth $10 million to them in pure profit. Yeah. So we're going to see a shift towards making sure that the discounts are fully optimized as opposed to the price increase is fully optimized. It's how fast down the line you want to go. And without a doubt, the cycle, and business does go in these cycles, is erring now towards the side where there'll be pressure on prices and then a pressure to discount more to either win or retain business.
But I mean, it stands to reason that you can't possibly discount effectively and at the right rate until your starting price point is optimized against the market and based off your value, right? So it's a great focus to have, but it's a after the fact thing that you'll be able to do more effectively. So a benefit of nailing your pricing strategy is your discount strategy will fall off the back of that. And again, you may find that you need to discount 5% less than you thought because your actual starting point is better reflective of the value on offer. So yeah, it all just kind of all comes together is the point.
Well, that's right. Well, I always say in some of my seminars and workshops, if we went into business as Persian rug sellers, what discount will we put on the front of our shop? Is it save 5% or 10%? No, it's usually save 70 to 90%.
Yeah.
So if we're going to offer a 90% discount, our RRP is going to be set accordingly to allow us to create that retailing theatre for our customers. Yeah. So you're absolutely right. It's about setting your architecture correctly, and then using value-based pricing principles that we talked about earlier to try and get that architecture right. And I will say that despite pricing is not necessarily a perfect science, it's really thematic. So you want to try a thematic to aspire to get value pricing correct. A lot of clients often get hung up on saying, what's the exact value that we can charge for this item? And you might not know the answer to that, but you know that you want to move that price up. So in terms of for the viewers on this call wanting to know what to do next, probably one of the best things they could do is conduct a range of experiments backed by a hypothesis or a theory around what value looks and sounds like. And then that will create that learning that they can do to then feed back into their price architecture.
Fair play, and that gets them into that optimized space if they can, step up into that area. Well, probably not optimized; that's more managed, but then maybe optimized. Anyway, I'll stop talking myself into a big hole that I'm digging. All right, cool. Look, let's leave it there. It's been a great chat. Thank you for being our first remote guest as well, making it work, which has been fun. As before this, we're like, oh God, we have to get Mike set up. I forgot that it's not always as easy remote. But anyway, that's all good. We got there. Yay us. People will be able to find you on LinkedIn. You write a lot of good quality content on there, so you're worth a follow. Obviously, Ron Wood, easily spelled. Pricing Insight is the company. Anything else you want to spruik while we've got you on here? Maybe your pricing university is something we should talk about?
Oh, sort of one of the things for clients that want to, educate their teams, where they don't need a consulting environment, they just want to build the capability inside the business. We've got on-demand education that people can access, so teams access. A lot of our clients around the world empower their teams to make better pricing decisions through education. So pricinguniversity.com.au is also worth looking at. It might be relevant to some businesses.
Nice. Great. Okay. Well, mate, we'll leave it there. Thank you very much for coming on. Love your work and hopefully talk to you soon.
Cheers, Brendan. Thanks for having me.